Thank you so much for coming. I'm Owen Jones. I'm a journalist at The Guardian and an author. We've got an absolutely fantastic panel here to discuss just economies. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the panel, though I'm sure they'll be able to explain what their work and what they've been doing and what they specialise in. But we've got Syneth here on the right, who is an award-winning journalist who specialises in inequality. He was the rural affairs editor at The Hindu and a founder editor of the People's Archive of Rural India. He has a huge body of work stretching back a very long time indeed. Faiza, who I've been honoured to know for a very long time, is the director of the think tank Caste, which looks, and an economist, but which looks at alternatives, of course, to neoliberalism, which is, of course, the topic that we'll be talking about today. Now, we, of course, live in a world where 8 billionaires own as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity, where the richest 1% are on course to control 2/3 of the world's wealth. In Britain, where we are now, of course, we've seen an economic crisis which has afflicted much of the Western world since the financial sector plunged us into economic calamity, where the wealth of the richest 1,000 people has more than doubled during one of the worst economic traumas in this country's history, whilst the wages of working people has fallen for the longest period since the 1750s, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So huge yawning inequalities across the world, which have different manifestations, and the scale and is obviously the specifics differ from country to country. But what we have in common is that neoliberalism has been hegemonic for more than a generation, and we've seen a huge concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a very small elite. For a long time, we've had this sense of there is no alternative. It was Frederick Jameson, a left-wing scholar, who said over a decade ago, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But I think even until recently, it was more apt to say it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism became the common sense of our time. There is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of this country, once put it. That has begun to change in different ways. We've seen in this country the rise of a Labour Party, which has explicitly defined itself against neoliberalism, but we've also seen the rise of xenophobic and nativist populism in this country and elsewhere as well, and reactionary movements, not just in places like Britain, but also in the global south. So there's lots to talk about. What I'm going to do is ask our fantastic panellists just open for a few minutes with some thoughts. I'll ask a couple of questions, but most importantly, I'd like to hear questions from the floor. So do think through any questions you'd like to ask, because you've got the honour of having two fantastic panellists, so you might as well exploit that to its full potential. So should we kick off? Who wants to kick off first? Do you want to go, Faiza?
Yeah.
Give Faiza a big round of applause first.
Thank you. And let me just start by saying what an honour it is to be here. I kind of see my own history as very much linked to the Commonwealth, of course. My mum was from Pakistan and my dad was from the Fiji Islands. And people here, because people don't have a good understanding of the empire, there's a tiny bit of empire amnesia in this country. And they don't understand how someone like me could come into being and come to live in London. But I do feel like a child of the Commonwealth, and so it's great to be here. So just a little bit about the organisation I run. So the Centre for Labour and Social Studies Class. The UK is kind of obsessed with the issue of class. You would have read Charles Dickens and seen various Downton Abbey, various things that demonstrate the class structure in the UK way back when, but also the ways in which those things still matter today. And the organisation, because we have this very unique link for a UK institution, a UK think tank, this link to the trade unions who set us up, we are always thinking about issues of power. And though I'm an economist, over the years, I've realised more and more how much this comes back to issues of power. And I just want to reflect on both some of my work in the UK, but also internationally. I worked at Save the Children during the time that we were coming up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And just observations from what happens on Goal 10, and the observations of being at the UN and seeing that conversation unfold. So Owen said a little bit about that. People often forget that Britain has a massive inequality problem. are one made by policy, and it is important to remember that. We are often told that inequality is just the outcome of globalization or, things that we can't control. That's not the case. That's not the case in terms of the evidence. The evidence tells us again and again that one of the main drivers for inequality in this country is the smashing of the unions, deunionization, the fact that workers no longer have power. So when I talk about inequality as a problem in the UK, I think probably the most striking example of that in recent years that we had the financial crisis caused by essentially bankers incentivized to be more greedy. And what we got as an outcome of that is more neoliberalism. We had striking cuts to our public services. So what we've seen is more people using food banks. Back 10 years ago, we just saw a few thousand food packages handed out every year. I mean, we are one of the richest countries in the world, so we'd expect that. That has gone to above 1 million. On the other end of the scale, we've seen the richest 1,000 individuals see their wealth double in size in the last 10 years. So we've seen that for a while in the UK, we did have more, sort of less inequality between the 99% of us and then the richest 1% were running away. What we've seen in the last 10 years is that bottom 1% fall away as well. So we're seeing that, that the society's band kind of being stretched at both ends. And we have, and it's important to say as well, of course, we have issues of wealth and income inequality, but we also have issues of race and gender and class inequality that are very much intertwined with this issue of income and wealth. And I think we don't do enough to bring the inequalities agendas all together, and we often find ourselves trading off. So just reflecting on a couple of things that I did globally, and just picking up on that point about how equality groups and the issue of economic inequality is often pitted against each other. So I was lucky enough to work for an international organization where I got to observe a lot of what was happening at the UN and at the World Bank and elsewhere when a lot of decisions were being made about what the new goals would be, and also the financing for development part of that. And what struck me, and I don't want this to get lost in history, there's obviously a goal 10 of the SDGs, which is about inequality, reducing inequality within and among countries. That was very vulnerable to deletion up to the end. It was only because civil society continually intervened and stopped it from being taken out. And the thing that we found very difficult about it was essentially there are too many goals, some are going to have to go. You've already got gender, why do you need something on economic inequality as well? So that was, you know, and we had conversations around that equality trade-off. And we also heard, and it was really interesting for me as someone from a working class background to observe, was that there weren't many people that we could get on side within that group of UN advocates for different countries, because many of them were up for doing some stuff around gender, group-based inequalities, but because themselves came from, I think, rich backgrounds and from privilege, found it hard to understand why it is that we would need to make real structural change in the economy, and that those issues of inequalities in their countries wouldn't be solved by an agenda just about race or gender. And so it really did, I mean, in the end it was there. Unfortunately, the way in which it was watered down within some of the measures that were attached to some of those goals. We didn't have a target on wealth inequality, for instance, and the measures of income inequality were relatively tame. And it really did strike me, looking at that and then looking at what I've seen in the UK over the years, is that whilst people like to talk about economic inequality, they are aware that it's a problem now, much more than it was even when I started my career. I always say this, but you know, my economist at the time, my head economist at the time when I was doing a PhD on inequality told me, Faiza, no one cares about inequality, you're wasting your time. And this was just before the financial crisis. So we've come a long way in that respect. But what we do see is lip service being paid to economic inequality and inequality, and unwillingness to really do what it takes to address that. And the reason for that is that once you get into a conversation about economic inequality, it's not just simply about a few social policies on the side. It's that plus doing something about jobs, doing something about investment in regions that have been ignored for a long time. It's about what you do in terms of power and who has power, the workers. It's about what you do on wealth and who's accumulating wealth and who's not. It's incredibly difficult in many political situations. So those are just some initial thoughts from me about what it is that's stopping change from happening. Because I know I don't want to spend another 10 years saying the same old things and the same old numbers. I want change to happen, like I'm sure many people in this room do as well. So I think it's important for us to lay out what the real problems are. I don't think there's an issue of ideas. Of course, like we can do more on the ideas, but the issue is one of who's in power and what they're willing to do.
Fantastic stuff. And now, of course, we're going to move over to Sainath. Give him a warm welcome as well.
Thank you. The kind of inequality that has expanded in many ways, not just economic, but it has had its fallout in social, cultural, and political terms as well, in a country the size of India is simply enormous. And you're not going to catch it only in numbers, though the numbers are very significant. This March, on March 8th, India's billionaires did us proud. There are now 121 of them in the Forbes billionaires list. There wasn't a single one before we embarked on our neoliberal adventure in 1991. In year 2000, there were just 8. In 2012, there were 53. This March, incidentally, Forbes announces its billionaires list every year on March 8th, International Women's Day. Maybe it's an aspirational thing, or maybe it's a time zone thing. Maybe they do it on March 7th and we see it already on 8th. But 121 Indians who are billionaires now have a wealth equivalent to 22% of our GDP. We are talking about 121 individuals in a population of 1.3 billion, accounting for 22% of GDP. The richest amongst these, Mr. Mukesh Ambani, Forbes tells us that he added in the last 12 months $16.9 billion. I don't know how much that is in GBP, maybe 12 billion, something like that. But $16.9 billion in 12 months, which means he added to his 2017 wealth at the rate of $1.95 million an hour. Now, that could have been by the dint of his labor and the sweat of his brow, but less charitable minds like my own tend to think it could have been by subtle changes in government policy that favored some corporations in a particular sector. Because what the last 25, 30 years have been about is what we call a market-driven economy, which is really a corporate-driven economy. And I think the fundamental issue, if you're going to tackle inequality, is that you ought to be able to confront corporate power. You're not going to get anywhere if you're not willing to do that. You can make transitory changes that look good for a bit and are good for a bit, but it's very difficult if you do not set out to tame corporate power. Now, look at Mr. Mukesh Ambani's earnings. What is $16.9 billion and how many Indians could earn that amount in 12 years? In the country's flagship rural employment guarantee program, it would take 18.7 million rural Indians to earn that amount in 12 months. And they would work 365 days without a day or a weekend off. 18.7 million. To earn that 16.9. And incidentally, on the Rural Employment Guarantee Program, they're not given more than 100 days per household a year. But assuming that we do that. On the other hand, what do ordinary people earn? The Socio-Economic Caste Census of India, 2012, 11-12, the year we had 53 billionaires, showed us that in 75% of Indian households, rural households, there are 179 million rural households. In 75% of those, the main breadwinner takes home less than $80 a month. Or that would be about what, 50 pounds? In 90% of rural households, the main breadwinner takes home less than $160 a month. Yeah. And farm households, because the inequality crisis has worst affected the agrarian sector. In 20 years, government data show us over 300,000 Indian farmers have taken their own lives, committed suicide, distress-driven suicides largely. We have found a solution to that problem. The National Crime Records Bureau, which keeps the data, has stopped publishing them for 2 years. So the average farm household in India, the last figure tabulated, income from all sources, farming and non-farm activity, $99 for a 5-member household. So you're looking at someone who's adding $1.95 million an hour, and someone, a 5-member household in the agrarian sector, pulling in $99 a month from all income activities. So that's had a tremendous effect on the countryside, the collapse of agriculture, gigantic migrations. The first census in our history, 2011, showing urban India adding more human beings than rural India, partly because of the migrations, which are taking place rural to urban in every way, with tens of millions of people becoming footloose migrants with no final destination. The migrations crisis, by the way, when millions of men are migrating or moving out of agriculture, you cannot capture what happens to women farmers in numbers. So the cycle goes on of spreading distress and thinking that it's going to be fixed by more market, more economic fundamentalism. It's a bit of a throwback to medieval Europe. You know, when the guy died, the doctor said, we should have bled him more. You know, that's what they said, when we should have bled the guy more. And that's the logic on which this, I just want to give you a little glimpse. I personally think that if you want to fight inequality, one, you've got to confront corporate power. Two, you simply have to roll back some of the processes of the last 30 years. Do not kid yourselves that it's possible to make substantial change without throwing out some of the things we have done to our societies, to our poor people in the last 30 years. I just want to give you a glimpse in pictures of the kind, because numbers will not do it, though I have thrown a lot of numbers at you. As this inequality spreads, and as Faiza said, people have told us that it really doesn't matter, what are you wasting your time on this subject. In Mumbai, where I live, and which is the capital of a state which claims to be in its biggest drought in 70 to 100 years, buildings are coming up, which I'd like you to see. These are multi-storied buildings with 37, 40 floors and 2 towers in each, and they've got a swimming pool on every floor. You can see one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, these are called balcony pools. After I wrote about them, they still advertise it, they're still selling flats, but they've stopped mentioning the swimming pools in the ads. And this is how it will look when you know, if the artist's vision or nightmare is completed. So that's 74 floors, and you're seeing 75 swimming pools because the builder has a penthouse in between. And there's an equivalent number scheduled for the other side. I don't know if they'll all come up, but the work is on and they're advertising flats. So that's how grand it would look. The bottom 10 floors are just parking. Now this is the garish, ugly Mumbai. I'm from Chennai, and we consider ourselves a far more refined culture than Mumbai. So we go for a swimming pool only every 3rd floor. Yeah, and my favorite is if you drive down from Mumbai to Pune, this is my favorite hoarding. They're very unsporting about this. I write about these things, they immediately take them off. But the hoarding is still there, and you can see what it, you can, I think that one seems to have got dropped. But, well, this is how the average Indian collects her water. There you go. She's standing on 5 stones, taking water from a leaking pipe, pouring it into one vessel into another, filling them up, then taking them back. And She did that 40 times while we watched her, which meant that she covered 12 kilometers, with half of it with about 60 liters of water in her hand. That is how traditionally people in the countryside collect their water, waiting for the public tap to open up. Yeah, so the inequality shows up now in terms of access to water, because a few kilometers, in the very region where these photos are shot, breweries and alcohol factories get water about 20 times cheaper a liter than that woman does. Okay? So it's in every dimension you're seeing this inequality, and the fact is, no society can sustain that indefinitely. So what are we going to do about it? How do we go about pushing it back? That's what we're here to discuss.
Oh, there you go. Give him a big round of applause. Fantastic openers from both of you. Sainath, one thing, just to put to you this, the defenders of what we would call neoliberalism, privatisation, deregulation, the destruction of the social public sphere in favour of the market and so on, they would argue that in the last generation there has been an unprecedented fall in global poverty because of the policies that they've advocated. And yes, inequality has grown, and we can talk about billionaires and the number that have increased, but also at the bottom end, people's living standards have substantially increased as a result of those policies. How do you respond to that?
You're looking at societies in collapse from these inequalities, and we are saying, the numbers don't show this. My favorite Wasserman cartoon in the Washington Post was at Reagan in the 1983 recession really biting deep. And he was on it's a ship called USS Economy, it's sinking, and only Reagan and his press secretary are hanging on to the bow, and the press secretary is hanging on with one hand and says, Mr. President, the latest CBS New York Times poll shows your approval rating up by 80%. However, the voters have all drowned. Yeah. I'm saying that this focusing on numbers which are largely fraudulent, questionable, we have spent the last 2 decades redefining what is poverty, redefining what is housing, redefining what is sanitation. Of course you can bring the numbers down. Secondly, it's like there's no link between poverty and inequality. Third, the most basics of what a being should expect, most of our societies are not delivering on those. And for us to say that, look, the numbers show something different, shows higher living standards than ever before, sure, it shows you those swimming pools, right? But also, you can call it what you like those last 35 years, neoliberalism or globalization, or, capitalism is good enough for me, but, it's also a way of describing a particular phase of what's been happening in the last 30 years. I think that there's a heck of a lot of, you need to worry about this level of inequality. And it's interesting that many of those who dismissed it earlier, the Brookings Institution had a thing saying the debilitating debate on inequality in the 90s. But many of those, including the IMF and the World Bank, are now talking about it, are now being forced to recognize what a serious issue it is.
Faiza, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess just to say on that, if you think about how inequality is felt and what it means, and especially where it happens on race lines within a country or regional lines. So I looked a bit at Pakistan, for instance, and sure, overall it looks like, and you can use averages and you can, that poverty is reduced. And I've seen my own family, go from not having fridges to having a fridge over the last 25 years. At the same time, what you've seen is areas like Balochistan, you've seen the disparities between Balochistan and other areas of Pakistan that have managed to get some funding, some investment, and some attention grow massively. And the consequence of that, so one statistic, for instance, is child malnutrition. It's about 85% odd level of malnutrition in Balochistan. In Islamabad, it was something like 20%. So, those huge disparities. And what does that mean for a country, and why is it that kind of inequality is important? Is it demonstrates what is happening in terms of how that country's not being held together, the political disruptions that happen as a consequence of violence that has erupted in some areas. And so, we have to look at inequality because it also highlights how we're getting on as a society, how close we are together. And there's some really interesting stuff also about empathy. In more equal societies, we have more empathy for each other. And so in a way, when you have huge inequalities, and you've seen inequalities grow in many countries, and here in the US especially, they've done these kinds of studies, which demonstrate that because we don't have that empathy now for each other, because we live very separate lives, we're in these flats with swimming pools or whatever, versus living an everyday life or poor, that you just don't have the support for the types of welfare systems that we need to deal with that. So it's kind of, the issue of inequality is also important in understanding how we get to deal with poverty overall and have sustainable measures that tackle inequality. So these things cannot be divorced.
Yeah, they can't be, and it's a very significant point that you're making. If you look, Mumbai is the capital city of Maharashtra. Mumbai is one of the 12th richest city in the world or some such thing. Okay? And Maharashtra is the richest state in India, state of 120 million human beings. Last year, the High Court of Bombay expressed its grave displeasure at the death of 17,000 human beings of hunger and malnutrition in the tribal areas pretty close by to Mumbai. 17,000 in 12 months. So, who are we, what are we trying, why are we trying to delude ourselves that if poverty is falling, you don't have to look at other things?
Before I open up to the audience, another question which I want to ask, I'll start with you, Faiza. In terms of alternatives and where we're at with that. After World War II, the proponents of free market liberalism were completely isolated because of the experience of Great Depression, the consequent genocidal World War which ensued. And they organised. They went to Mont Pelerin in Switzerland. You had Milton Friedman, you had Hayek, you had Karl Popper, and they set up these international think tanks to lay the intellectual foundations for a counterattack to the shift to welfare capitalism and so on, so that when the 1970s economic crisis happened, they were ready and waiting. They'd already laid those foundations with Thatcherism, Reaganism, and so on. It strikes me the left, up to the financial crisis, were in a very defensive position, defined by, oppose cuts, oppose privatisation, then oppose austerity, rather than having a coherent alternative. Has that changed? Do you think now we are seeing the foundations being laid to a genuine, serious alternative, which isn't just defined by being opposed to neoliberalism and trying to preserve existing gains?
Yeah, I feel like I can only really speak about that from a UK perspective. Both Owen and I have been involved very much here on the left politically, and I think both of us quite pleased by the kind of the great strides we've made. And actually, a few years ago, I could never have imagined we'd be in a situation where we have a leader of the Labour Party that's actually very left and progressive and doesn't want to bomb places. So, I think that in terms of that alternative, I think, look, we know, and I've seen this, I did this project interviewing general secretaries of trade unions around the world, and I just would hear the same thing again and again about what's happening in terms of labour market, flexible labour markets, so they call it, precariety, zero-hour contracts, the insecurity in whatever way that looks like for people, private provision of public services, and unfortunately even I've seen that when I worked at Save the Children, that differed, essentially allowing sort of schools that charge and pushing some of that agenda, less taxes and tax avoidance. There's certain parts of this model that we hear again and again, and so we know that some of those things, in a sense, simply need to be reversed, right? We need to be much stronger in terms of asking our businesses and big corporations to pay their fair share. We cannot let them get away with putting money in tax havens and all kinds of tricks that they are using. We really do need to come together on that. And I have to say that when I was observing the finance for development conversations, even trying to build an international tax forum, a conversation, which unfortunately was blocked by the US and the UK, and it's quite, the powers that be that don't want to change some of these things, it's quite frightening. That wouldn't happen with a left government here. So I think there's that, but there's also the big case that we need to make, and this is happening certainly in the UK. And we have to imagine in this country, we had the financial crisis caused by the banking sector, and then basically what was blamed, this is hard to believe, but what the narrative was, who was blamed was essentially too much money went to public services. So, I mean, it's quite something. You'd watch this conversation. I was in a very early part of my career, and we knew it was a financial crisis, you know, a global financial crisis, something that started in the US, etc. And every week, you'd hear politicians come on and say, no, this is because we spent too much money. And the outcome of that was that we reversed our spending in public services. And that is an ideology, and that's an ideology that we see around the world. So how we make the case for a people-first economy, right? That's what an economy is for, it's making sure, and that also investment in people, in regions, in various different transport, etc., public transport, health, that also has an impact on economic prosperity. So, you know, there's a very clear arguments there, and there are the ideas. It's just how we build movements around that, and I think that is happening in places.
I mean, just quickly on that side, if you look at, take India, you have the marrying of Hindu nationalism with market fundamentalism. It strikes me the Indian left is at a very low ebb. I mean, is there a sense of an alternative in India to those sorts of this paradigm, if you like?
The left is at a very low ebb. And yes, I mean, I think that the kind of alliance that is ruling India is showing up in many parts of the world. It's essentially an alliance of socio-religious fundamentalists and market economic fundamentalists who have been able to work with very different political regimes who are on the same economic lines. And I want to say, you know, about the alternatives and will things get better? Yes. They're going to get a lot much worse before they get better, okay? Because we are still on those 7 or 8 tracks that were unleashed worldwide a few decades ago, maybe 3 decades ago, maybe 4 in some parts of the world. That is, and those include many things. You know, the gutting of the welfare state, the imposition of user fees and on those who could least afford it, the privatization of education, driving tens of millions of children to nowhere, the privatization of just about everything, including intellect and soul. You know, 15 years, 20 years ago, when I was introduced on public platforms as a public intellectual, I used to wonder what the heck that means. I sort of figured out that it means those of us who haven't been privatized yet into think tanks, and, you know, okay, we are maybe waiting for the right price or simply incompetent or whatever. All these processes have taken deep root. The suborning of local governance, the undermining of democratic governance, the incredible rise of corporate power, and with it, you know, the right came to power in many countries to roll back big government. Your task will be to roll back big corporations. That's one of the tasks that you're going to face. Yeah.
Right, I'm going to open it up. What I'm going to ask people to do is have a question, not just a statement, you know what I mean? And I'm going to get a gender balance as well, just FYI. Okay, you three here, and then I'll move over to the front because you were very enthusiastic. So, yeah, kick off there, and then we'll work backwards. And this is Gemma, by the way, and there's also Craig somewhere. Hi, Craig.
Hi,
if you could say your name as well and where you're from or anything like that.
Yep, I'm Ken Bluestone. I work for Age International. I'm based here in the UK. I wanted to pick up on the point of this people-first economy, and I can't help but wonder if this doesn't have the problems we're facing don't have their roots in the way that we define economic value and contribution in society. And we're fixated on GDP, or governments are, as the macro measure. And that's created this schism in which we've got the devaluing, basically, of, well, say, the valuing of the formal economy. If you're earning a wage, if you have cash in your hand, right, that has economic value. Whereas for the majority of the world's population, this is particularly important where older people are concerned, their economic contributions are not monetized.
That's right.
Some are, but not all. And it's exactly the same with valuing women's work as well. So how do we reorient our definitions, our understanding of what economic value is, in order to release that potential that exists and give people the support they need?
Fantastic. So you'll be first next, I promise, when we do the next round.
David Jones from the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work. I take very seriously it's going to get worse before it gets better. I come from the county in this country, UK, where the county council has just been made bankrupt and the government said, sorry, we can't give you any money to help because that will reward failure. Who will suffer? The weakest and most vulnerable people will suffer because of their failed political leadership. So this is a local issue, but across the world it is a really big challenge, and I write some global reports on this. So my question is, picking up what Owen said, I'm afraid I do not see yet the intellectually coherent alternative. I really don't. And I don't think that Jeremy Corbyn is articulating it. He isn't convincing, although he won more votes than I expected at the last election. So those of you who are responsible for doing this thinking, where is the thinking happening and how can the rest of us join it? Because the more likely outcome, surely, is what you've described, the far-right triumph. And that is a very disturbing future. But that is the more likely outcome because they can appeal to nationalist and protectionist concerns. And I think that is what is happening. Where's the coherence?
That's cheered me up. That you, and then we'll come to you first, I promise, then you afterwards, and a woman as well.
I'm Eva Eckerholm from the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, and thus I keep the environment quite high. And sometimes I think the lack in GDP and the accounting on richness is that we don't include the environment in it. The oil-rich country, when all of a sudden the oil has gone, they're not rich any longer. But the same when you degrade the country and climate change is just being to the climate justice on climate change. And that is an issue that should be incorporated in the wealth and justice. I would like to hear your opinion.
What was your name again, sorry?
Pardon?
What was your name again, sorry?
Eva.
Eva, got you. Thank you. Well, great questions, everyone. I mean, just to combine that, the first and the last there, because this is this narrow fixation on GDP. You know, we talked there about informal work, about the fact that women do the vast majority of unpaid labour all over the world, and also that issue about, obviously, the environment. How would you answer that in terms of this narrow, very narrow definition of GDP and it not taking into account those other factors? And how do we value, for example, those sorts of labour?
Yeah, no, I've had the same issue with GDP for many years, and I do think it's essentially used as a neat way to get to all of those underlying issues. So all of those underlying policies, neoliberal policies, are essentially, right? So as long as we grow, it doesn't matter. Growth is that's the other thing that my head economist said to me way back when, that Pfizer don't care about inequality, no one cares, care about growth, or if you're a nice person, care about poverty. So absolutely, I think, you know, how do we change measures, indicators like that are so intertwined with, you know, the way the World Bank reports or the IMF and so how do we push that agenda at that level whilst at the same time, so I try really hard when I talk about economics now to not use GDP and to use other things. So we can change our own language, we can talk about measures, so environmental measures, right? What good is growing if we are damaging the planet? What are we doing on inequality? And I always use a measure of what's happening to children and mental health often, because I think those are better measures of how we're doing as society. But I think we need look, in this country we try to push for measures of well-being, but unfortunately those were kind of co-opted and haven't really helped the agenda and haven't really helped to push us away from GDP, I mean, I think it does come into your point about an alternative. So I think, you know, how far we can force alternative thinkers and alternative potential, in whatever country we're in, politicians to start talking about these other measures is really important. Look, yeah, absolutely, we still need to have an alternative plan, and it has to put the planet there up front, right? And so often we have a conversation about economics over here, and we have a conversation about the environment over here, and then we have the conversation about women over here. And so how do we, and that's what I mean by people first economy, how do we bring all of those things in? I think, look, it wasn't perfect, but the manifesto that came in the last election in this country, so that you can look it up, the Labour Party manifesto, I know because I recognise a lot of things in there, that actually took from a lot of work that people doing the ideas work on the left have been doing for many years. It picked up on a lot of those ideas. And in some respects, right now, it's more of a bucket list of things we'd like to do. So it says things like bringing things like trains and water, etc., back into public ownership in a democratic way that is run by people. And what it says is that you shouldn't make profits off water. I mean, let's think about it. Who owns the water anyway? You know, where we can start that renewable energies. And so right now it's a bucket list, but it does get to the values change that needs to sit alongside these ideas, right? So that's what we often forget. We think we can make this list of policies and that's fine. But actually what we're doing is changing the values in this country, certainly, and around the world. We've been told, you know, look after yourself, an individualized notion. Even with the way our tax system has worked or our public services have worked, apart from the NHS, the National Health Service here, we too often think about these things about what we get out of them, and rather than ways in which we build solidarity, in which we look after each other. So how is it that our policy ideas play into a new value system? Because that is what we're talking about here, ultimately. That is the sustainable change that we're talking about. And it has to, as opposed to the sorts of things we saw in the post-war consensus, it has to include the environment.
Simon.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that besides just a different discourse, you need a new language for describing much of what's going on. There was an attempt in the early 90s when Professor Mehboob Haq of Pakistan and Professor Amartya Sen of India tried to create the United Nations Human Development Index.
Yeah.
Incidentally, India, which ranks number 4 in the dollar billionaires in the world, way ahead of the UK, ranks 131 in the Human Development Index. So there are other measures that have been created, but it's not the establishment of a different language. Now, per capita income, GDP. I mean, if we demolish this QE2 building, we're going to add to growth, right? And then if we rebuild it, we'll add to growth again, and we can do this indefinitely and keep doing that. In 2003, by the way, the fastest growing economy in the world was Afghanistan, because in 2002 it had been leveled by the most vicious, insane bombing attack. So you built 2 hospitals and 20 kilometers of railway line, you doubled the GDP, right? So that's what you did. So this was part of the neoliberal adventure of 30, 40 years, that government's only job is to take care of the growth numbers. That's all that governments were judged by internationally. What were the growth numbers? Yeah? And as so, yeah, about the protest and the inarticulate or articulate things of alternatives, I have never known that alternatives are born articulate, packaged, and coherent. I've never known one. I see in that chaos, in that torment, I see people trying, I see people struggling, I see people fighting. On this March 6th, 40,000 of the poorest peasants in India took a long march, 112 miles from Nashik to Mumbai, yeah, and won over the city of Mumbai. Look, this was 40 degrees heat Celsius in which they were marching. Many of them had no footwear. They were too poor. They sellotaped their souls to take on the searing heat of the highway because they had no shoes. And they came to the city of Mumbai. The last 10 miles, they marched in dead of night, silently, without a single slogan, to the main venue, because, as they explained to me, the next day, tens of thousands of children in Mumbai were sitting for their board examinations. And the women farmers told me, our kids write exams too, you know. We don't want to disrupt those exams. We don't want the children to be disturbed on the morning of their exams. It was astonishing. Middle class people, upper middle class people, government employees, workers, poor workers in the slums, came out and gave food packets, water packets to these marchers. They won them over by that tactic, by a way of protest. But the protest is there. There are 1 million protests. The idea is, how do we coalesce this? How do we get them? You know, it's not as if while that's happening, those in power are going to sit quietly. They're going to use every tactic and means possible to divide people on ethnic grounds, on religious grounds, on various other grounds. So that may be ugly, that process. There is protest. There are alternatives. They are not coherent. And on the environmental issue, I totally agree. I mean, it fits in with what you were saying. You need a different language. Actually, I think that it was David Attenborough who said so nicely that anyone who believes in infinite growth on a very finite planet is either an idiot or an economist.
Pithy. Right, I've got the next three people to ask a question, but don't worry, we've got half an hour, so we've got lots of time, so don't panic. It was you first, I think. Yeah, it was you, then it's the woman over there. I'll come back, I promise, next round, I promise. I can't fit you in this time, but I will the next round, I promise. Please don't attack me anymore. Go for it, go for it.
Right, massive thanks to all the panelists for doing such a great job. My name is Kennedy. I'm a Nigerian, but I live in Preston, Lancashire. I am not an economist, okay, so I am not going to sound like one of you. I'm just going to be very basic here because I'm here to represent the people of the Commonwealth who doesn't understand all of these language that you're speaking, who doesn't understand the figures and all of these big words. But Adam Smith said something that he is certainly not a good citizen who does not wish to promote by every means in his power the welfare of the whole society of his fellow citizens. Now, I may not be able to define economy just the way you guys have talked about it, but I know that economy is about managing available resources. And I want to believe that there is no single person in this room who doesn't need food, clothing, and shelter. That is our basic needs. None of us here can survive without any of these three things. But I've got a massive issue here. Why is it that the people who provide the very first one, food, are about the poorest in so many countries, including the UK, the farmers? The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2 talks about eradicating global hunger, right? How do we want to or intend to achieve this when we continually make people feel that farming, agriculture is a bad business?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, that is my very big problem there.
Okay, is that okay? We'll stick with that question, is that okay?
Yeah, here is something else I think we should...
just quickly, because we just want to get... I want to get as many questions as I can, but go for it very briefly, if you may.
Right. Here is something I think we should put forward to, the heads of our government.
Yeah.
In trying to really build a fairer economy and in the spirit of redefining our Commonwealth, can we stop this whole thing of class? Is it possible that we can, keep class where it belongs? Can we just forget about the grade? If we really mean business here, unless this whole thing is just a charade. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, definitely eradicate the class system. I'm with you there. But you over there, I will come back to you, I promise.
Okay, yeah. My name is Husia Michwabi. I'm from South Africa. I want to be specific to India. You spoke of billionaires. How much money from South Africa has made billionaires? Because we know that how much money circulating in India is from South Africa. Because we have a problem with a family called the Guptas.
Yeah.
So I want to know how much money those billionaires is from the country.
Okay.
And we, in the next few months, we'll be hosting the BRICS meetings. And me and you are trading with China and Russia. So how do we resolve I think we know there are international issues between the two countries. So how are we going to go out of that mess? Thank you.
Thank you. And then yourself over there, the woman over here. Sorry. And I will, you, and then somebody else afterwards. Go for it.
Thank you for this really excellent panel. Okay, so when I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, Gabrielle Hussain. So in Guyana, one of the things that they're struggling with is the recent deal with ExxonMobil for recent oil finds in Guyana and the bad deal that the government cut with Exxon and the damage that it's going to do to the country. Now, it seems to me that all over the world, different countries are fighting ExxonMobil or fighting Shell or fighting whatever. But they logging companies, water privatization, Pepsi. But the struggle is divided by the nation-state boundaries. In other words, Guyana is now fighting ExxonMobil on its own, Mobil on its own. But in 4 or 5 other countries, they're probably in the very same battle. You know, what are our strategies or our thoughts for advancing the ways that we can come together, less so much around, you know, G7, Commonwealth, whatever, and get together around fighting Pepsi's multinational water privatization, fighting Exxon's multinational bad deals that they have the power to cut. And because it seems to me that one of the weaknesses in individual governments having to negotiate with big corporations is the big corporations are able to function globally, and nation states are not thinking that way. So how can we start that with civil society?
Great range of questions again. So first from Kennedy about, in terms of, the people who provide the food globally, often the poorest, about global hunger, about taking on the injustice of class. Who see about South Africa, how much money there is from there in India, and the upcoming BRICS meeting, and finally that point about the struggles against multinationals globally like ExxonMobil, Shell, Pepsi, and so on. Do you want to kick off this time?
Yeah, sure. The food issues and the hunger issues you're talking about, actually, you know, that sector exemplifies the kind of corporate power that I'm talking about. Okay? If you look at after the collapse of Wall Street in 2008, you look at the Fortune 100 fastest growing companies of 2009, the top companies are the food and agribusiness companies. Hundreds of other sectors are in collapse, but the guys in food and agribusiness rank first by revenue, fourth by profit. Okay? They outdo oil, they outdo everybody else. When you've got control of the food, you control the world by its belly. Second, the entire trade in agricultural commodities across the world, it's controlled by half a dozen corporations. Okay? When you had a UN Special Rapporteur looking at this issue saying that 60% of wheat traded on major global markets, yeah, was controlled by investment funds, index funds, and the like. 60%, yeah, was controlled by investment funds, not by farmers. Right? And the issue that you're raising about farmers, worldwide, Midwest United States, India, UK, Africa, the devastating collapse, what I call the predicament of the rural, you know, destroying livelihoods in the name of providing alternatives, a scheme built on a totally wrong reading of history, that jobs are going to open up in industries. You know, actually not a single new job was created for farmers leaving agriculture in India, and they were in millions. Nothing of that sort happened. So if you're looking at, if your issue is food and hunger, you know, Rabindranath Tagore, the first non-European Nobel laureate, said more than a century ago, food is a source of great wealth. Food production, a source of great misery. Because those who produce that food go hungry. Right? So if you're going to talk about that, I also want to tell you one thing that about, since the question of alternatives and principles keeps coming back, there is a forgotten section, what I call the invisible clauses of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 4 decades of Cold War, we only knew of one, Article 19, right? Not that it was unimportant. Of course it's important.
Freedom of expression and speech.
Yeah, freedom of expression and speech. But look at Articles 22, 23 to 27. They are about the right to form unions, the right to association, the right to collective bargaining, yeah, the right to a decent family living wage, the right to paid holidays, the right to health, the right to work. All these are part of a universal declaration that every country on this planet is a signatory to. Well, maybe there are one or two who aren't, but largely. Okay? How come we never fight? We can coalesce around this. The enforcement of government's obligations to implement the pledges that you made when you signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the Indian case, there is a specific chapter in the Constitution called the Directive Principles of State Policy. I believe something like it exists in the Irish Constitution also. Yeah? So you have things on the food issue that you can, that there are many, it's got to bring us there. The second, about the South African contribution. You know, I don't think it's just South African. I think we make money in a lot of other places. Okay, at the present, Indian corporations are making millions and millions out of fertile land in Ethiopia, from where some of the most ancient agrarian societies, like the Gambeli people, have been displaced from very fertile land for guys growing roses. For whom are they growing roses? For the markets in Amsterdam, for the flower hubs in the Netherlands. Okay? Food production is being displaced by cash crop production and other stuff like that. It's happening all over the world as agriculture itself comes under the control of corporations. So Indian corporations are very aggressive out there. I think, you know, the Guptas, by the way, would be small potatoes compared to our resident billionaires, like someone who, I don't believe they've ever earned $2 million an hour for 12 months, okay? But I take your point. Yeah, and the point is also that the global super rich have seceded from their nations. You know, they're in a gilded ghetto where they make money from all points of the planet. Actually, I really think even Kenya, closer by, Indian rose factories. Okay, each rose takes 5 liters of water. Yeah. So you have companies and the lands of the farmers surrounding that area, the rose plantations, are going dry. About the corporations and what you can do. One of the things is, by the way, and I come to you as a journalist. Incidentally, I am not an economist. As you said, you're not one. I want to assure you that you have a company. You know, it's also in part of this thing of the alternatives to look at the monopoly and capture and hijacking of the media. Okay? How differently the world is presented in the media from that which people actually experience. Okay? Now, you're seeing this wonderful, you know, edifying spectacle of Facebook, but do we put it together and point out to people that the digital monopolies are actually the nastiest in history? Unlike any other earlier generation of monopolies, these guys own your personal data. They traffic in it, they sell it, they buy it. I call them human data traffickers. Yeah? And the kind of monopolies, 78% of all search, one company. 68% of all online auction, one company. That kind of monopoly is unrivaled and unfettered. Yeah. So we also need to think about that. By the way, when you look at the Exxon and when you look at Mobil and when you look at the great BP, look at BP's great oil spill of 2009, the room, as a New York Times reporter reported, the bulk of the room was filled not with reporters at the press conferences, but PR agents, because public relations jobs have been growing at a rate of 3 to 1 to journalism jobs in many countries, including and especially the United States. So the picture the world is given is also one completely filtered through a corporate lens. Yeah, so you need to think about all those when you're talking about alternatives. And yes, you can fight corporations, you can drive them out. People have fought major displacement battles in Latin America, in Asia and Africa, and defeated them sometimes. But the power of these is overwhelming. So you're going to have to think out again a new discourse. How do we join forces across different protests? That's what I was talking about.
Faiza, some thoughts, and then I just want to bring in 3 more. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just picking up on that point about how we fight corporations when they're cross borders, and I think it's a really important point, not just in the way that you brought up about oil, but also in terms of tax. So I've forgotten what country he was from. It might have been Ghana. There was an ex-finance minister that spoke at a conference I was at a few years ago who basically said that it was like the directors of some company had flown in and they said, listen, if you give us this and this deal, so essentially you've got to subsidize us to come here, then we'll stay. But if not, we've got the plane ready and we can go. But essentially they had the plane ready and they can just go to the country next door. And they were, you know, playing these countries off each other, saying, getting their own way on tax. And so one of the things that he was talking about what they did, and this is certainly something that they've been trying across the EU, is to, at that level, at your regional level, is to try and force all heads to say, okay, we are going to not have a race to the bottom. We're not going to have a competition between us on some of these tax levels. We have to actually get some alignment across these things. And certainly, there's been issues within the EU just because of, for instance, the kind of UK's relationship with some tax havens. But in the EU, they've managed to clamp down on what Apple were doing with Ireland, and Ireland's had to get much better on these things. Although then Apple used another way round to get, you know, so it is very difficult, but the only way you can do that is to build cross-government alignment on some of these things. And I think, look, there's a way as civil society in which we can help that, and I've seen this, I don't mean this as that it's easy, but essentially when you find these incredible injustices and you know some detail about them, you know where the money's coming from, you know who's been hurt, and you, as much as possible, raise awareness of those issues in the lead up to various summits, you have the answers ready as to what needs to happen, and you find your civil society partners who can then reach out to journalists as well, you know, wherever you can, then there is a way in which you can create noise, and that's where we have seen some changes. And I think tax avoidance has been one area where there has been definitely, compared to where we were, some wins. The problem is, of course, is that what's happened is that whilst we've got good at making the argument about tax avoidance, we're losing the argument overall about tax in terms of corporation taxes being lowered. So, you know, there are ways in which these can be done, and it's not to say that they are easy, but really it's the only way to have sustainable change, like you say. And just quickly to pick up on your point about, you know, not all economists are the same.
Poor Pfizer, honestly.
But yeah, definitely, like it's a management of resources, but the point is for who, right? And I think with the class, you know, I agree with you. Ultimately, you want to eradicate classes, but what's happened is certainly in this country, what they did is to undermine the kind of working class struggle was one of the ways in which the elite were able to have more power and were able to accumulate more wealth. So at least in the interim, we do need to build more solidarity amongst working people, amongst people that are suffering the consequences of policies that aren't in their interest, that are making their everyday lives much harder. So how can we use what's left of the union movement, or what's growing in some countries of the union movement, where can we bring people together? And we know that that's happening, you know, with that example of the farmers coming together to build solidarity, because, you know, these battles can't be won on our own, and we have to bring people together.
Great. Can I ask these next questions to be pithy and to the point? Thank you. Yourself, the woman, you as well. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And you. We can squeeze you in, but do be to the point. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. The mic will come to you.
I'm Daniel from Kenya.
Tammy, was that?
Daniel from Kenya, yes. My question is about, maybe I wish they can comment about the external borrowing, which is becoming a big burden to most of the Commonwealth countries. And I wish it can be addressed, because this issue of external borrowing is creating a big burden to most of the countries. And this can only be addressed because China is coming in and they are saying this money. Then finally, there is a lot of inequality in most of the countries. Please comment on that.
Okay, great. That was pithy. Yourself? Oh, no, one second. The mic will come to you. And if you can say your name as well. And
Tanya, London. It's about just economy. It's about corporations paying their fair share back. There's something that really worries me is about what is happening in the media that you so aptly described, that makes it this whole thing very palatable and very acceptable, and why we would have people like Bill Gates in spaces like this, why we would have the very rich people in a ski resort in Switzerland kind of determining the policies of the world. So is there something we can do as citizens? Is there something we can do to hold the state to account? What can we do? Because it feels like all these people, all these billionaires are paying back, and the growth in philanthropy and alternative ways in which there is some arbitration in the world, which is very worrying, and I'd love to hear what you feel about it.
great. And then yourself?
I'm
and then over there.
I'm Fadla Wilmot from Muslim Aid. I'd just like to ask, isn't part of the problem the way we teach economics? And isn't there, because the focus is on wealth rather than human beings and living within the finite planet that we live. So don't we have to really change the way we teach economics, because politicians are taking this advice from economists?
Absolutely.
So that's my question. The other part of my question is, I'm just reading Yanis's book.
Yanis Varoufakis, former Greek finance minister.
Yeah, and this, just I'd like to ask both of you, and the weak must suffer what they must. And isn't this whole burden of austerity falling on the weakest countries and the weakest people in the countries?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes, I'm Irene from Namibia, Southern African Alliance on Youth Employment. So I just want to touch on the issue of empathy that was spoken about. It really touched me. So the issue of when it comes to just economics or wealth distribution in Africa has been linked to land for the past years. So it's the access to land for young people, access to land for women. But if you look at countries, especially in Southern Africa, where even after independence, political independence, people gained political independence, but they didn't get the land, and which they could create wealth from. So my question here really is, when it comes to empathy, somebody that is having privilege, how will it be possible? Is it even relevant for that person to feel empathy for the next person and just give up the land? So the relevance of empathy is really what I want to contribute to and touch on.
Great stuff, Erin. Thank you for that. And not sure that's a little bit cheeky. Do you want to just add a very, very, very quick comment? Just because we're going to get thrown out by security in 6 minutes. So no.
Yeah, it will be a quick comment. My name is Brenda. I'm from Zambia. My question is based on what Daniel spoke about. It's a contribution, though, where politicians, decision makers in a country tend to borrow or tend to spend on, example, a jet of about $70 million, and hospitals don't have medicine.
Yeah.
So where's the inclusiveness of the indigenous people?
Very good point. Very good point. So there's a lot there. So that point, Daniel, external borrowing, about the role of economists there from Tanya, about billionaires presenting themselves or being presented as philanthropists and their image makeover. That point about this finite planet we live in and the way we need to change our language when we talk about these things. And then finally, empathy, wealth distribution, and so on. Go for it. And your final thoughts, because we have to leave in 5 minutes. So this has got to be pithy, quite wide-ranging. Oh, we've got 10 minutes. Oh, right. Oh, well, okay. Well, then not. We might be able to get 2 quick questions in, depending on how quick this is.
Go ahead, Liza, please.
Yeah, I mean, external borrowing is not something I know lots about, though I know it's been an issue, so I might let Seni pick that up. In terms of the media, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think Owen will know about this too. We see not only just a representation of the elite, but also establishment ideas. So there's very little space often in our mainstream media to say there is an alternative, or not be treated, not have people like me be treated like we're a bit stupid, really. Yeah. And to some extent, that has changed. That is sort of changing in some spaces because there are new media forms coming forward, and that might be happening in other countries as well, where people are just fed up and they're coming together and they're using new technologies and YouTube to kind of start doing their own thing, and sort of websites, etc., where people go, I know what I try and do is just follow all kinds of people on Twitter, both here and internationally, the kind of dissenting thinkers, because otherwise I don't really know what's happening. Mm-hmm. And actually this is shown in a number of polls around the world, that people just don't trust the media anymore because they understand what they're hearing doesn't fit with their lives. So this is certainly key to change. In terms of what we can do individually, like I say, we've got to try and find, unfortunately for now, we have to try and find the dissenters. And you'll see sometimes on Twitter people say, I'm trying to decolonize my Twitter thread. Can someone tell me who to follow? And lots of names will come up, or female economists, or whatever it may be. So, you know, we have to do that ourselves. And because that space has become popular, the media is seen, the mainstream media is seen as kind of behind. So they didn't at all, for instance, see that the Labour Party might do well in the last election. So they've been embarrassed into having to listen more. On teaching economics, absolutely. So at least in the domestic agenda for class, what we're doing is that we are doing some economic boot camps for activists this year. We are doing some training of MPs. Unfortunately, our MPs, even on the left, often don't understand some very basic ideas about the economy and literally bought into some of the ideas of austerity, even when it is bad economics. There's a real issue of economics, as powerful and as important it is for our lives, being seen as some expert issue that someone else is dealing with somewhere else. That should not be allowed, and don't let anyone ever tell you that it's, you know, happening, someone else has kind of got it covered, because they don't. Economists don't know what's happening, as we've seen from their lack of knowledge of the financial crisis happening and the rest of it. So, you know, those of us that are running organizations and doing bits and pieces on this, it's on us to try and do some of that education. And certainly austerity has hit the weakest the most. In this country, it's probably been one of the most racist policies. It has hit women and the poorest, and then the poorest women, and then the poorest women of color the most, quite substantially more than other groups. And, you know, it's interesting that people don't see it that way. Just in terms of decision-making and that point that was raised, you know, land ownership, and, you know, I understand that because similarly in Pakistan, they didn't do the land ownership program, and we've got feudalism that's created all kinds of issues. People won't just give up their land, I think is the point. I think it's very hard to persuade people of that. You need policies in place, you need to have a transition where that land is better shared out. Of course, you need to explain why that needs to happen. You know, the history of how that land was acquired and who essentially paid or worked for free or worked for very little to work that land. And so sometimes in a process of building empathy, you do need, you know, you need to do it in a sensible way, but I don't think that people just give up their land. They just don't. There's that great quote for people that have had privilege, equality feels like oppression. And I think we see that in many ways over the world. And just finally on decision-making, this does come back to representation. So like I said, with the UN, and here I'm constantly on panels on discussions about issues of the welfare state, for instance, social security, as some of you may think of it, with people that have never experienced what it's like to have to, you know, have hardship and go on government benefits or go to state schools or go, you know, use public hospitals. And that's why we need to all, and I'm speaking at something later on this week, and constantly talk about it and constantly try and encourage people from more working class backgrounds and from different backgrounds and people of color to run for powerful positions and get into those decision-making positions, is that for me is, unless those voices are there, it's not going to change. So again, unfortunately, the onus is on us to have to like take the blow and really like work to be in those spaces, even if it means, and this happens to me constantly, I'm, you know, the only person of color in the room, and it's frustrating because you have to explain a lot of things. We have to do it, because if we're not there, then those conversations don't happen.
Absolutely.
You know, the first and the fifth questions about the external borrowing and the, you know, it's very clear that in country after country, the borrowing is done for the rich and the payoff of the debt is done by the poor. We have in London an Indian billionaire, alas, dropped off the Forbes list into the, you know, penury of mere multimillionaires. And he owes the banks, Dr. Vijay Mallya owes public sector banks, including banks of poor people, of farmers, of workers, of retired employees, 90,000 million rupees. He has sought asylum here, and it's very difficult to get him back. Yeah, so laws of taxes, laws of confronting power, corporate power, all of it, it comes back to those. Second, about the media, Tanya, that is, you know, many of our countries, like say the UK or India, I would say, technically, the media are free. The way I describe it is, the media are, in our countries, in India certainly, is politically free, imprisoned by profit. Who owns them? Who controls them? Today, any decision taken by the government of India for further privatization, which is the only decisions governments take, benefits 5 top media barons. If we privatize the spectrum, 3 media barons benefit. We privatize mining, 3 top media barons benefit. We privatize oil and natural gas, 3 top media barons benefit. Why the heck are they ever going to present those policies in a negative light? That's crazy to even imagine that that would happen. How do we fight it? One, as Faiza said, there are many experiments coming up where people are trying to. It's not easy. But yeah, we need to look. One of the battles that we need in the fight for democratization is democratization of the media and decolonization of the digital. It is not a new battle. Though the digital is a new battle, the democratization and decolonization of the media is a battle that you can go back to 1980 to the Schoen-McBride report of UNESCO and how stunningly accurate many of the prophecies and projections of that report and its associated papers have been in the building of monopolies. We can fight them, you can defeat them. The devastation of the teaching of economics, well, it's also the teaching of history, it's the teaching of politics. Economics has taken the central, you know, it's taken the pole position, okay? So that's what's destroying everything else. And yes, obviously it's going to hurt the poorest of the poor, the weakest of the weak. In India, it's devastating the indigenous peoples, the tribes. It's devastating the Dalits, the scheduled castes, the so-called former untouchables. It's wiping out the kind of scholarship structures they have for their education, especially for higher education. These are areas where the Dalits have made significant advances in the last 20, 30 years, now being bashed up, bank and fund jargon like direct benefits transfer. Earlier, governments used to give their budgets to universities, and the universities would advance some money for the scholarships of students, and then get it reimbursed by the government. Now the government says direct benefit transfer. It'll take a year to reach that student, who in the meantime is essentially self-funding. Okay, so it is, and the kind of things that have happened in agriculture have devastated women farmers. And by the way, speaking of the need for the new language, the workload of women has more than doubled in farming, but their work participation rate is at a historic low because most of their work is unpaid work. It's not going to be calculated. Okay, it's not going to be calculated. So yeah, so the burden of austerity is on them. And the empathy factor, yes, I do believe that there is empathy. I do believe, as I saw in that protest in Mumbai, people from other classes coming out and saying, yeah, something is going terribly wrong, we have to be there. I would like to say that protests are happening. People are fighting. We did see an Occupy Wall Street movement. It had much more of an impact outside of Wall Street than it did on Wall Street. People are fighting, they are protesting. Things will get worse, but there are protests happening, a growing sense that what we have now, it's not possible to sustain, it's unjust, it's iniquitous, and we have to fight it.
Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time. Before I just quickly wrap up, I'll abuse very briefly my position as chair. The injustices, as I said at the beginning, that we all suffer from differ in specifics and scale, but there is much in common. All of us are fighting against societies where profit is prioritised ahead of people's needs and aspirations. And just thinking just quickly about this country, not that far away, in the richest borough, in one of the richest cities, in one of the richest countries that has ever existed, a few months ago, dozens of working class people, many of them migrants, many from minority backgrounds, burned to death in a tower block in Grenfell, where the cladding was chosen around that tower block, which was flammable because it was cheaper, where fire safety regulations weren't enforced because that's red tape, where working class people warned for years beforehand that if they were ignored, there would be a terrible disaster and people's lives would be lost, where sprinklers weren't installed because that had cost money. That calamity, that atrocity, which never should have happened and was easily preventable, sums up in an extreme way how rotten this social order is. That it's not just an order that puts money before people's needs and aspirations, but their lives. And of course that's true particularly acute in the global south, but we have seen in this country, whether it be the housing crisis, where millions are deprived of the basic right to a decent, affordable home, where 1 in 4 young people in this capital city grow up in an overcrowded home, with all the damage that inflicts on well-being and educational prospects and health, damaging their potential, but also the potential of the entire country as well. Whether it be the lack of secure jobs, the longest fall in wages for many, many generations, younger people with a worse lot in life than their parents, older people who freeze to death in their homes in one of the richest countries that has ever existed because they can't afford to pay the energy bills. These are all colossal injustices. Most people in poverty in Britain are in work. They earn their poverty every single day. And all I would say is these injustices we all suffer from, that they won't be defeated one country at a time. The people we're up against have no respect for borders, and that's why we have to unite across all of us, all of these movements for justice. We have to unite together to build a global movement that can overcome these injustices and build a new social order that is not run in the interests of multinationals and the scandalous rich elites who keep plunging us into crisis after crisis, then walk away whistling and allow everybody else to pay the price for the crises that they have caused. So let's renew our determination to do that. Please give a big round of applause for our fantastic panel.